Howdy, partners, and welcome to tonight's tale from the untamed frontiers of the American West. As the evening sun sets over distant mountains, we invite you to lay down your weary head and drift into the mysterious world of Red Dead Redemption. Each night, we'll share different tales from these wild lands, where outlaws and legends still roam free. And when our story ends, the gentle sounds of the frontier, crackling campfires, distant coyotes, rustling prairie grass, and the soft whisper of the wind will carry you into peaceful dreams beneath the star-filled western sky, with no advertisements to disturb your slumber. Now, saddle up, partner, and let's mosey on down to tonight's tale. The first hint of twilight crept across the sky as Elijah Morgan guided his horse along the overgrown trail. Behind him rode 4 other travelers, companions by circumstance rather than choice, each drawn to the promise of New Austin's untamed frontier for their own reasons. 3 days of hard riding had left them all bone-weary, their faces etched with the fine dust of the trail and the silent resignation of those who'd seen too many sunsets without proper shelter. Elijah, at 62, had crossed this territory more times than he cared to count, yet the winding path through tall trees still demanded respect, especially as daylight waned and shadows lengthened beneath the towering pines. "How much further to Manzanita Post?" called Sarah Winters from the middle of their small procession. At 28, she was the youngest of the group, a widowed schoolteacher from back east seeking a new start in Blackwater. Her question carried no complaint, merely practical concern as she adjusted her spectacles and glanced at the darkening sky. Elijah turned slightly in his saddle, the leather creaking beneath his weathered frame. "Won't make it before dark, I'm afraid. These woods aren't kind to night travelers. We'd best find a place to make camp soon." Thomas Reed, a barrel-chested blacksmith with hands like iron anvils, nodded agreement. "Been through here once before. Place has a reputation. Strange sounds after dark, they say." Despite his imposing physique, there was an unexpected gentleness to his voice, as if he'd spent a lifetime carefully measuring his own strength. "Superstitious nonsense," huffed Edwin Collins, a railway company surveyor, whose city clothes and precise mannerisms marked him as distinctly out of place in the wilderness. "Every frontier settlement invents ghost stories to keep children in line and strangers on edge." The 5th member of their party, a man who had introduced himself only as Webb, said nothing. He rarely did. With a face half hidden behind an unkempt beard and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing, Webb had joined their group at a river crossing the previous day, nodding his acceptance when Elijah mentioned they were headed toward Blackwater. He carried a harmonica in his pocket, but had yet to play it, and his rifle remained within easy reach at all times. As the trail curved deeper into the ancient forest, Elijah noticed a curious change in the quality of light filtering through the canopy. The expected blues and purples of approaching evening seemed infused with a warmer glow, almost amber in tone, that couldn't be explained by the position of the setting sun. Following instinct honed through decades in the wilderness, he guided his horse toward this anomaly, sensing rather than seeing a small clearing ahead. "There's something up yonder," he called back to the others. "Might be a suitable spot to make camp." The trail widened suddenly, opening into a perfect circle of a glade ringed by massive pines that seemed to stand sentinel around the perimeter. At the center burned a campfire, not the raging blaze of hunters or the desperate signal of the lost, but a steady, measured flame that danced above a neat arrangement of logs, without smoke or spark. Despite the fire's obvious heat, visible in the way it shimmered the air above it, no one tended it. No horses were hitched nearby, no bedrolls spread on the ground. no coffee pot or provisions arranged for an evening meal. Yet the fire burned, steady and inviting, as if it had been deliberately set and carefully maintained just moments before their arrival. "Well now," Elijah murmured, drawing his horse to a halt at the glade's edge. "That's a peculiar thing." Sarah urged her mare forward, stopping beside him. "Someone must be nearby," she reasoned, though her voice held a note of uncertainty. "They wouldn't leave a fire burning unattended." "No tracks," Webb observed quietly, speaking for the first time since morning, as he nodded toward the ground surrounding the fire. The soft forest floor, which should have been marked with footprints, showed only the undisturbed patterns of fallen pine needles and small woodland plants. Thomas dismounted with a grunt, approaching the fire circle cautiously. The big blacksmith crouched, extending his hands toward the flames, before looking back at the others with an expression of puzzlement. "It's warm, all right. Real fire, not some trick of the light. But these logs..." He picked up a stick and prodded at the arrangement. "They're not burning down. Look here, no ash, no embers, just wood and flame, like a painting someone brought to life." Edwin Collins remained on his horse, regarding the scene with visible discomfort. "This is absurd. Fires don't maintain themselves. Someone is playing games with us. I say we move on and find a proper campsite." "Moving through tall trees after dark is asking for trouble," Elijah countered, easing himself from the saddle with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested most changes in position. "Mountain lions hunt at dusk, and the trail gets tricky in places. Besides," he added, removing his hat and running a hand through silver hair, "I've been riding these trails nearly 40 years and never seen a fire like this one. Makes me curious." As the 5 travelers debated their next move, Webb suddenly lifted his head, turning toward the deeper forest beyond the glade, as if he'd heard something. The others fell silent, straining to catch whatever had caught his attention. For several seconds, nothing disturbed the quiet except the soft crackling of the mysterious fire. Then it came, faint but unmistakable. The silvery notes of a harmonica drifted through the trees, playing a melody both melancholy and sweet. The tune was vaguely familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood, yet none of them could have named it. It floated on the evening air for perhaps half a minute, before fading away, leaving behind a strange sense of peace that seemed to settle over the glade like invisible dew. "Did you all hear that?" Sarah whispered, though there was no need to keep her voice down. The question wasn't about audibility, but confirmation that the experience had been shared. 4 nods answered her. Even Edwin Collins, still mounted and visibly skeptical, inclined his head in reluctant acknowledgement. "I believe," Elijah said slowly, "that we've been invited to stay." The decision once made carried its own momentum. They unsaddled the horses and arranged their meager camp with the strange fire at its center. Webb tended to the animals with quiet efficiency, while Thomas gathered additional firewood that went unused as the existing flame showed no sign of requiring replenishment. Sarah unpacked their food supplies, and Edwin, after initial resistance, eventually contributed his own provisions to their communal dinner. Elijah, who had served as cook on many cattle drives in his younger days, prepared a simple but satisfying meal. As he worked, he found himself humming the mysterious harmonica tune without conscious thought, his weathered hands moving with the muscle memory of countless campfire suppers, stretching back through the decades. "This glade feels different," Sarah observed as they settled around the fire with their tin plates. "Listen." The others paused, forks halfway to mouths, heads tilted in attention. The normal sounds of a forest preparing for night surrounded them. The rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an early owl, the whispering of pine boughs stirred by a gentle breeze. Yet beneath these expected noises ran a current of something else, almost like distant conversation, punctuated by occasional laughter that sounded more like memory than reality. "Do you know where we are exactly, Mr. Morgan?" Sarah asked, turning toward Elijah. "Is this place marked on any maps?" The old frontiersman shook his head. "Can't say that it is, Miss Winters. This trail was used for cattle drives 30, 40 years back before the railroads changed everything. Lot of history in these woods. Lot of men passed through, not all of them making it to where they were headed." "You mean this could be some kind of burial ground?" Edwin asked, his earlier skepticism briefly giving way to unease. "Not formally," Elijah replied, "but when a man falls on the trail, you bury him where he lies and mark it as best you can. Nature takes back her own pretty quick out here. The forest keeps its secrets." Thomas Reed nodded thoughtfully, his massive hands cradling a coffee cup that looked like a toy in his grasp. "My uncle drove cattle through New Austin back in '78. Used to tell stories about special places along the old trails. Said some spots felt protected, like something watched over the men who stopped there." "Superstition," Edwin muttered, but without his earlier conviction. Webb, who had been silently attending to his meal, suddenly reached into his pocket and withdrew his harmonica. The unexpected movement drew all eyes to him as he turned the instrument slowly in his hands, studying its surface in the firelight as if seeing it for the first time. Without explanation, he returned it to his pocket, but the gesture somehow altered the atmosphere around the fire, making the unspoken presence of something beyond their understanding seem more tangible. As night fully claimed the forest, the mysterious campfire maintained its steady glow, neither dimming nor flaring, requiring no attention, yet providing perfect heat and light. The travelers spread their bedrolls within its circle of warmth, and a comfortable silence settled among them, the kind that usually emerges only among old friends who have shared many trails together. "I remember a story," Elijah said suddenly, his voice merging with the night sounds in a way that made his words seem like natural extensions of the darkness around them. "Heard it from an old drover named McReady, back when I was just a young man riding my first cattle drive through these parts." The mysterious campfire burned with unwavering constancy as Elijah's voice wove through the night, carrying his companions into memories older than any of them had lived. A flame's steady light illuminated faces grown attentive and relaxed, while just beyond the circle of its glow, the forest seemed to listen with ancient patience to a tale of its own secrets being retold. McCready had been past 60 when Elijah met him, a lean, sun-dried man with eyes that had gazed across more open country than most people could imagine. He'd started driving cattle before the war, back when New Austin was still disputed territory, and a man's only law was what he carried on his hip. On a drive in the autumn of '69, McCready's outfit had been caught by an early snowstorm while crossing through tall trees. 2 men and nearly a dozen cattle had been lost before they found shelter in a narrow valley. Night fell with temperatures dropping and supplies running dangerously low. McCready told me he'd given up hope, Elijah continued, his weathered face illuminated by the steady flame. Said he'd made his peace and was just hoping to last until morning so they could bury him proper. That's when he saw it. A light moving through the trees. Thought it was delirium at first, but the other men saw it too. The light had led them to a small clearing where a campfire burned despite the snow. A fire much like the one they now sat around. Beside it, they'd found fresh coffee in a pot and enough food to sustain the outfit until the storm passed. Though they searched at first light, they found no tracks leading to or from the glade, no sign of who might have prepared the site and left such providential supplies. McCrathy swore they'd been saved by the ghost of some long-dead trail cook who couldn't rest while drover men still faced danger in his territory, Elijah concluded. Said he'd heard similar tales from others over the years. Campfires appearing when most needed, sometimes with food waiting, sometimes just offering warmth and direction when all seemed lost. The story settled over them like a comfortable blanket, fitting itself to the unexplained fire around which they gathered and the strange music they'd heard upon arrival. Even Edwin Collins remained thoughtfully silent, his rationalist objections temporarily suspended in the face of their shared experience. "Do you believe it?" Sarah asked after a moment. "There's some guardian watching over lost travelers." Elijah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I believe that not everything in this world answers to our understanding of it, and I believe there are bonds between men who've traveled hard trails together that don't necessarily end when one journey does." He gestured to the fire between them. "As for this, well, I'm grateful for its warmth without needing to explain its source." Thomas nodded in agreement, his broad face solemn in the firelight. "My uncle said much the same, called it trail magic, said you don't question gifts found along the way, just accept them with proper respect." Webb, who had been listening silently, suddenly rose from his place and walked to the edge of the firelight. For a moment he stood motionless, silhouetted against the darkness, head tilted as if listening to something beyond the perception of the others. Then, with deliberate movements, he withdrew the harmonica from his pocket, raised it to his lips, and began to play. The melody that emerged was the same they had heard earlier, hauntingly familiar yet impossible to place. In Webb's hands, the simple tune gained depth and emotion, speaking of lonely trails and faithful companions, of hardships endured and moments of unexpected beauty discovered in harsh lands. It carried both sadness and comfort in its notes, like memory itself given voice through the small metal instrument. As the music flowed around them, something extraordinary began to happen at the edges of their vision. Fireflies emerged from the surrounding forest, hundreds of them, their tiny lights blinking in patterns that seemed almost synchronized with Webb's playing. They drifted through the glade in lazy spirals, creating ephemeral constellations that formed and dispersed in rhythm with the harmonica's rise and fall. Sarah gasped softly at the display, while Thomas watched with childlike wonder despite his imposing size. Even Edwin Collins found himself mesmerized, his rational mind temporarily surrendering to the magic unfolding before them. Elijah observed it all with quiet acceptance, as if witnessing the confirmation of truths he had long suspected, but rarely seen so clearly demonstrated. Webb played for perhaps 5 minutes before lowering the instrument. The fireflies continued their dance for a moment longer, then gradually dispersed back into the forest, leaving only the steady light of the mysterious campfire illuminating 5 faces, transformed by what they had witnessed. "I think," Elijah said quietly into the silence that followed, "that we should get some rest now. Seems to me we're being looked after tonight." No one argued. They settled into their bedrolls with murmured goodnights, each carrying private thoughts about what they had experienced. The last sight Elijah registered before sleep claimed him was Webb, still sitting upright, his silhouette against the unwavering fire forming a tableau as old as the frontier itself. A solitary figure keeping watch while companions rested, guardian of momentary peace in a vast and often unforgiving land. Elijah woke sometime in the deep night, roused by nothing he could identify. The fire continued to burn with that same steady light, needing replenishment. His companions slept peacefully around it, their faces relaxed in ways that daylight rarely permitted. Even Edwin Collins, so rigid in his waking hours, had surrendered to the vulnerable honesty of sleep. Only Webb was absent from the circle. Moving with the quiet caution of a man accustomed to wilderness living, Elijah rose and scanned the glade. He spotted Webb almost immediately, standing at the edge of the trees, engaged in what appeared to be conversation, though no one stood visible before him. The man's posture was relaxed, head slightly tilted in the attitude of someone listening intently to words being spoken just below the threshold of ordinary hearing. Elijah remained motionless, reluctant to intrude, yet drawn by a curiosity that outweighed his sense of propriety. As he watched, Webb nodded several times as if in agreement with whatever silent communication he received. Then, with a gesture that seemed both farewell and acknowledgement, he turned back toward the camp. Their eyes met across the firelit clearing. For a long moment, neither man spoke or moved. Then Webb approached, his expression revealing no surprise at finding Elijah awake and observing him. "Old friends?" Elijah asked simply when Webb reached the fire circle. A faint smile crossed the bearded man's face, the first Elijah had seen from him. "You could say that," Webb replied, his voice rough from infrequent use. "Known them a long time," Elijah nodded, accepting the cryptic response without pressing for elaboration. Both men settled beside the fire, sharing silence that required no filling with unnecessary words. Around them, the forest breathed with its nighttime rhythm, occasionally punctuated by the distant call of an owl or the soft rustle of leaves stirred by gentle wind. "Been on the trail long?" Elijah finally asked, the question emerging naturally from his thoughts. Webb considered for a moment before answering. "Longer than most, not as long as some, heading anywhere in particular, just following the trail where it leads." Webb's gaze remained fixed on the mysterious flame as he spoke. "Some journeys don't have destinations so much as purposes." The response might have seemed evasive from another man, but from Webb it carried the weight of simple truth. Elijah sensed that further questions would yield similar answers, accurate but revealing little beyond the surface meaning of the words themselves. "This fire," Elijah observed instead, nodding toward the steady flame between them. "You know something about it." It wasn't a question, but Webb treated it as one. "It burns for those who need it," he said. "Offers warmth without consuming, light without revealing too much. Been appearing along these trails since before men like us started crossing them." Men like us. Webb's eyes, reflecting the firelight, held ancient knowledge that seemed at odds with his physical appearance. Travelers, seekers, those moving between what was and what might be. He paused, looking directly at Elijah. Those carrying burdens too heavy to be seen. The observation, delivered without judgment or particular emphasis, nevertheless struck Elijah with unexpected force. He had carried his own invisible weights for decades, regrets, losses, choices that could never be unmade. The trail offered escape, but never complete freedom from the past that rode always at his back. "The others," Elijah said, glancing toward their sleeping companions. "They felt welcome here too." Webb nodded. "Fire calls to what each person needs most. Rest for the weary, direction for the lost, memory for those who've forgotten important truths." He lifted a stick and gently prodded the flame, which responded with a brief flaring of light, though the wood remained unconsumed. Sometimes just the knowledge that they're not alone on the trail. They lapsed into silence again, sharing the deep quiet of night while their companions slept undisturbed. Eventually Elijah felt his own eyelids growing heavy once more, the mysterious fire casting its spell of peaceful security over him. despite the unanswered questions that lingered in his mind. "Get some rest, old-timer," Webb said softly. "I'll keep watch till morning." Elijah nodded, settling back into his bedroll with the ease of a man accustomed to finding sleep wherever circumstances permitted. His last conscious thought before drifting off was a vague realization that Webb had spoken more words to him in their brief exchange than he had uttered throughout the entire previous day's journey. The morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight filtering through the tall pines that surrounded Manzanita Post with natural majesty that no human construction could rival. Elijah woke feeling more rested than he had in years. The weight of accumulated solitude temporarily lifted from his shoulders. As he completed his morning ablutions and gathered his few possessions, he found himself humming Webb's haunting melody without conscious thought. When he descended to the inn's small dining area, he found his three companions already gathered around a rough-hewn table. They greeted him with the easy familiarity of old friends rather than chance-met travelers, the shared experience of the mysterious campfire having compressed normal social development into a single extraordinary night. "Sleep well?" Thomas asked, pushing a cup of steaming coffee toward the empty chair clearly reserved for Elijah. "Better than I have any right to at my age," Elijah confirmed, settling into the seat with a grateful nod. "You all?" Sarah smiled over her own cup. "Like a child after a bedtime story. I can't remember when I last rested so completely." "Same here," Thomas agreed. "No dreams, just peace." Only Edwin seemed slightly less transformed by morning light, his brow furrowed with renewed analytical concentration. "I've been thinking about what we experienced," he began, leaning forward with intensity. "A fire that water couldn't extinguish, Webb's appearance ahead of us despite our more direct route, the music we all heard." "Still trying to explain the unexplainable, Mr. Collins?" Sarah asked, though her tone held gentle teasing rather than criticism. Edwin managed a self-deprecating smile. "Old habits persist, Miss Winters, but I'm approaching it differently now." He produced a small notebook from his breast pocket, opening it to reveal several pages of careful notations and sketches. "I believe what we encountered deserves documentation, even if complete explanation remains beyond our reach. Future travelers should know what awaits them in those woods." "A scientific approach to the supernatural," Thomas observed with surprising insight, "measuring what can be measured while acknowledging what cannot." "Precisely," Edwin agreed, looking pleased at the blacksmith's understanding. "Last night changed my perspective, rather than abandoning it entirely. There's value in recording our observations, comparing them with others who might have encountered similar phenomena, establishing patterns, even if ultimate causes remain obscure." "I suspect Webb would approve," Elijah commented, slicing into the simple breakfast the innkeeper had placed before him. "He struck me as someone who bridges worlds, respecting mystery without being consumed by it." Their meal continued with comfortable conversation about practical matters. When the next stage would arrive, where each planned to go upon leaving Manzanita Post, how best to prepare for those journeys. Yet beneath these ordinary discussions ran deeper currents of connection, moments when a shared glance or brief pause acknowledged the extraordinary bond forged through their encounter with the campfire that never dies. As they finished eating, the innkeeper approached their table with an expression of mild curiosity. "Pardon the interruption," he said, addressing all four but focusing primarily on Elijah as the eldest. "Noticed you folks came in together yesterday. You passed through tall trees recently?" Elijah nodded cautiously, uncertain of the man's intent. "Crossed through 2 days back? Why do you ask?" The innkeeper hesitated, glancing around as if concerned about being overheard despite the empty room. "Just wondering if you saw anything unusual out there. Travelers lately have been telling strange tales." The four exchanged looks, silently negotiating who should respond and how much should be shared. Finally, Elijah spoke, choosing his words with care. "Depends what you mean by unusual. The forest has its own ways." Encouraged by this neutral response, the innkeeper pulled out a chair and joined them uninvited, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Folks talk about finding campfires with no one tending them, fires that burn through the night without fuel. Some say they hear music when no one's playing." He shook his head with a mixture of skepticism and wonder. "Been running this in 15 years, heard plenty of tall tales, but these stories keep coming from different sources. Merchants, hunters, even a circuit judge who doesn't strike me as the superstitious type." "Do these encounters have anything in common?" Edwin asked, his scientific curiosity clearly engaged. "Beyond the fire itself, I mean." The innkeeper considered this thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, most say they were in some kind of trouble when they found the fire, lost their way, injured, running low on supplies. One fellow claimed he was fleeing from Skinner's when he stumbled on a clearing with a fire burning. Said he felt safer there than he had any right to, given the circumstances." "And did anything happen to these travelers afterward?" Sarah inquired softly. "Anything unusual or unexpected?" "Nothing dramatic, if that's what you're asking. No curses or blessings, far as I can tell." The innkeeper scratched his chin reflectively. "Though, come to think of it, several mentioned having particularly vivid dreams that night. Not nightmares, mind you, but meaningful somehow. Dreams about people they'd lost or paths not taken." Thomas nodded slowly. "Dreams that help a person make peace with their journey, something like that." The innkeeper agreed. "So you did see it then? The fire?" Again, silent communication passed between the four travelers, a wordless agreement about how much of their experience should become public knowledge. Elijah sensed that Webb's role in particular deserved protection, not from fear or superstition, but from the kind of curiosity that might disturb the delicate balance he maintained between worlds. "We camped in tall trees," Elijah acknowledged simply. "Found good shelter and rest when we needed it. The forest provides for those who approach it with respect." The innkeeper studied each of their faces in turn, clearly sensing there was more to their story than Elijah's diplomatic response revealed. But he was a man accustomed to travelers and their privacy, to hearing fragments of tales whose complete telling remained confidential between those who had experienced them firsthand. "Well, you all look better rested than most who come off that trail," he observed, rising from the table. "Whatever you found out there seems to have done you good. That's what matters in the end, I suppose." As he returned to his duties, the four exchanged knowing smiles, their shared secret creating a bond that transcended their brief acquaintance. They finished their breakfast in companionable silence, each contemplating the journey ahead while carrying the memory of that extraordinary night like a talisman against future hardships. Later, as they prepared to go their separate ways, Sarah to secure passage on the afternoon stage to Blackwater, Thomas to inquire about work at the local smithy, Edwin to meet his survey team, and Elijah to resupply before continuing westward, they gathered one last time on the inn's porch for farewells that felt significant, despite their short time together. "I've been thinking about Macready's story," Sarah said unexpectedly, "about the trail cook who couldn't rest while others faced danger in his territory." "What about it?" Thomas asked. "I wonder if there's more than one guardian. If Webb is just one of many who tend fires for travelers in need." She adjusted her spectacles thoughtfully. "Perhaps they choose this role somehow, or are chosen for it when their physical journey ends, but their desire to help others continues." Edwin, who might have dismissed such speculation just days earlier, nodded slowly. A network of guardians across the frontier, maintaining safe havens at points where they're most needed. It would explain the consistent reports from widely separated locations. Some mysteries aren't meant to be fully solved, Elijah suggested gently. Just experienced and carried forward. He removed his hat briefly, running a hand through silver hair before replacing it with the practiced movement of long habit. Whatever awaits each of us down the trail, I suspect we'll view campfires differently from now on. They exchanged final handshakes and good wishes, promises to right that might or might not be fulfilled, expressions of gratitude for shared experience that had expanded each person's understanding of the world and their place within it. As they separated, Thomas toward the smithy, Edwin toward the surveyor's camp, Sarah to arrange her stage passage, and Elijah to the general store. Each carried away something intangible yet precious from their encounter with the campfire that never dies and its mysterious tender. Elijah completed his resupplying efficiently, years of experience having taught him exactly what necessities would sustain him between settlements. As he secured the last packages to his saddlebags, he noticed a familiar figure standing near the edge of town, partially concealed by morning shadows yet unmistakable in bearing and presence. They prepared a simple breakfast, during which Edwin Collins finally woke, immediately noticing Webb's absence with visible relief. The railway surveyor seemed to have recovered his skepticism along with consciousness, regarding the still burning fire with renewed suspicion rather than the wonder it had inspired the previous evening. "We should extinguish that before we leave," he insisted as they packed their belongings. "It's irresponsible to abandon an active fire, regardless of its unusual properties." Elijah nodded agreement, though privately he suspected the task might prove more complicated than Edwin anticipated. When their preparations were complete and the horses saddled, they gathered around the mysterious flame that had provided them with warmth and light throughout the night, without consuming its fuel or producing smoke. "Maybe we should just leave it," Sarah suggested uncertainly, "if it's been burning safely all this time." "Absolutely not," Edwin countered. "Fire is fire, and proper wilderness protocol is clear." He unslung his canteen and stepped forward with determined expression. "Stand back!" Before anyone could object, Edwin upended the canteen over the flames. Water cascaded downward and passed through the fire without effect, splashing onto the ground beneath while the flame continued to burn steadily, neither diminished nor disturbed by what should have extinguished it instantly. Edwin stared in disbelief, his rationalist worldview visibly crumbling beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. That's impossible." "Many things are, until you encounter them firsthand," Elijah observed without mockery. He moved forward and crouched beside the fire, studying it with respectful attention before addressing it directly. "Thank you for your hospitality. We'll carry word of your welcome to other travelers who might need your warmth." As if in response to his simple acknowledgement, the fire flickered briefly in a pattern that resembled no natural movement of flame. For an instant, all four travelers would later swear they saw figures within the fire, the silhouettes of men seated in circle, as they themselves had been during the night, engaged in silent communion around the endless flame. Then the image was gone, leaving only the steady burning that had welcomed them to the glade. Wordlessly they mounted their horses, each carrying private thoughts about what they had witnessed and experienced. As they prepared to depart, a familiar sound drifted through the trees, the distant notes of a harmonica playing that same haunting melody they had heard upon arrival. It lingered on the morning air like a farewell gift, then faded, as they guided their mounts back toward the main trail. "Webb," Sarah said softly, naming what they all recognized. Thomas nodded, while Edwin remained uncharacteristically silent, his certainties shaken by experiences that defied his understanding of natural law. Elijah simply tipped his hat in the direction of the music, acknowledging connection with something that existed both within and beyond the physical world they traveled through. The journey to Manzanita Post resumed with newfound camaraderie among the 4 remaining travelers. Their shared experience at the mysterious campfire had created bonds that transcended their differences in age, background, and perspective. Even Edwin, though struggling to reconcile what he had witnessed with his rational worldview, found himself drawn into conversation with his companions in ways that would have seemed unlikely just a day earlier. As they rode, Elijah found himself contemplating Webb's cryptic words about the fire burning for those who need it. Each of them had arrived at the glade carrying hidden burdens. Sarah's grief for her lost husband, Thomas's exile from a community that feared his strength, Edwin's rigid fear of a world that refused to conform to his expectations, and Elijah's own accumulated regrets from a life lived largely in solitude, despite countless temporary companions along the way. For one night, gathered around a flame that defied explanation, those burdens had seemed lighter. Whether through supernatural agency or simply the ancient human comfort of fire and fellowship, something fundamental had shifted within each of them. The trail ahead remained as challenging as before, the frontier as unforgiving, yet they faced it with renewed strength, drawn from their night in the glade. Late afternoon found them approaching Manzanita Post, the small settlement appearing through the trees as welcome evidence of civilization after days on the trail. As they neared the outskirts, Thomas suddenly reined his horse to a halt, pointing toward a large oak tree beside the main road. "Look there," he said, his deep voice colored by surprise. Seated beneath the tree, playing his harmonica with calm concentration, was Webb. He looked exactly as he had the previous day, showing no signs of hard travel, despite having departed hours before them with no direct route to follow. As they watched, he pocketed the instrument and rose to his feet, acknowledging their approach with the same understated nod he had offered when first joining their group. "How did you—" Edwin began, but fell silent as Webb turned slightly, gesturing towards something behind the oak tree. There, partially concealed by the massive trunk, burned a small campfire with the same steady, smokeless flame they had encountered in the forest glade. It flickered with familiar consistency, neither growing nor diminishing, requiring no fuel, yet providing perfect light and warmth to anyone who might pause beside it. Understanding dawned on Elijah first, followed quickly by Sarah and Thomas. Only Edwin remained confused, his rational mind still struggling to accommodate what his senses reported. "You're the caretaker," Elijah said simply. "The one who brings the fire where it's needed." Webb inclined his head slightly, neither confirming nor denying the assessment. His eyes, meeting Elijah's across the distance, held knowledge far deeper than his apparent years should have contained. "The trail provides what travelers require," he replied, his voice carrying easily despite its quiet tone. "Sometimes it's direction, sometimes it's shelter." He glanced meaningfully at each of them in turn. "Sometimes it's remembrance of what matters beyond the journey's end." Without further explanation, Webb turned and walked away, his figure somehow blending into the afternoon light, until he seemed to vanish between one step and the next. The small fire remained, burning steadily beside the road into Manzanita Post, a beacon for weary travelers, a reminder of mysteries that existed alongside the mundane realities of frontier life. "I don't understand," Edwin said, breaking the silence that had fallen over them. "Who is he? What is he?" Elijah shook his head slowly, a smile touching the corners of his weathered mouth. "Questions for another trail, Mr. Collins. For now, perhaps, it's enough to know that we're not as alone out here as we sometimes believe." Sarah nodded agreement, her face reflecting wonder rather than fear at what they had witnessed. Like guardian angels watching over the wilderness, or old trail hands who never quite moved on, Thomas suggested, his expression thoughtful beneath his bushy beard. Men who found their purpose in guiding those who came after. They continued toward Manzanita Post, leaving the mysterious fire burning beside the road. Though their paths would diverge once they reached the settlement, Sarah continuing to Blackwater to begin her teaching position, Thomas seeking work at the local forge, Edwin rejoining his railway survey team, and Elijah resupplying before heading west toward new horizons. Something of their shared experience would remain connected through memory and the subtle awareness that the trails they traveled were never truly empty. As twilight deepened into night, Elijah found himself unable to settle despite the comfort of a proper bed after days on the trail. Memories of their extraordinary experience pulled at him, demanding reflection rather than rest. Gathering his pipe and tobacco pouch, he made his way downstairs to the inn's small porch, where a simple rocking chair offered both solitude and a view of stars emerging above Manzanita Post's scattered buildings. The tobacco glowed as he drew on his pipe, its familiar aroma blending with the night scents of pine and distant wood smoke. From somewhere nearby came the gentle sounds of a settlement preparing for sleep, murmured conversations behind lit windows, the occasional laugh from the small saloon down the street, the soft nickering of horses in their stalls. Ordinary sounds that anchored the world in comfortable reality, despite the mysteries he had witnessed. "Couldn't sleep either." The voice startled him only slightly. Sarah Winters stood at the edge of the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. Without waiting for invitation, she settled on the rough-hewn bench nearby, her eyes reflecting starlight as she gazed toward the forest beyond the settlement's edge. "Too much to think about," Elijah acknowledged, offering his tobacco pouch out of habit, though he suspected she would decline. To his surprise, she produced a slender clay pipe from her pocket and accepted a small measure of the tobacco with practiced movements that spoke of private ritual rather than public habit. "Not what most schoolmarms would admit to," she noted, catching his surprised expression as she tamped the tobacco with a small metal tool. "My husband taught me, said a pipe helps order one's thoughts when the world grows too chaotic to make sense of otherwise." They smoked in companionable silence for several minutes, each respecting the other's need for quiet contemplation. When Sarah finally spoke again, her voice carried the dreamy quality of someone voicing thoughts that had been circling within for hours. "I keep thinking about what Mr. Webb said, that the fire burns for those who need it, that it offers different things to different travelers." She turned slightly, facing Elijah more directly. "What do you think it offered you, Mr. Morgan?" The question, asked without presumption or demand, deserved honest consideration. Elijah rocked slowly, watching smoke drift upward from his pipe to merge with the darkness above. "Perspective, maybe," he answered finally. "I've been wandering these territories longer than you've been alive, Miss Winters. Seen homesteads rise from bare earth and disappear just as quick. Watched towns spring up around railroad stations and mining claims, then fade away when the gold played out or the tracks went elsewhere." He tapped his pipe thoughtfully against the chair arm. "Easy to believe nothing lasts in this country, that everything, good and bad alike, just passes through without leaving permanent mark. He gestured toward the distant forest with his pipe stem. But that fire, burning steady without consuming what feeds it, reminds me some things endure, despite all evidence suggesting they shouldn't. Kindness among strangers, memory of those gone before, the comfort of finding welcome when you least expect it but most need it. Sarah nodded slowly, her own pipe sending thin wisps of smoke into the night air. For me, it was something like permission, she said after a moment. Since William died, I felt guilty about continuing forward, as if by building a new life, I somehow betray what we shared. Her voice remained steady, though Elijah sensed the depth of emotion running beneath her words. But sitting there by that impossible fire, I felt his blessing, somehow, as if he was saying it's all right to find new warmth in the world. Before Elijah could respond to this confidence, the inn's door opened again, spilling lamplight briefly across the porch as Thomas Reed stepped outside. The big blacksmith hesitated upon seeing them, clearly concerned about intruding on a private conversation. "Join us if you like," Elijah invited, gesturing to the remaining empty space on the bench beside Sarah. "We're just sorting through what we experienced out there." Thomas settled his massive frame with surprising delicacy, the bench creaking slightly beneath his weight. "Been thinking about my uncle's stories," he offered without preamble. Susie moved closer, appraising their tidy corners with wild eyes. Oscar leant back, bending his body over the frontier, spots where the boundary between our world and others grew thin enough that influence could pass through in both directions. "Like veils being parted," Sarah suggested. Thomas nodded. "Something like that. He believed certain people could sense these places, even help maintain them. Guardians, he called them, though that wasn't quite the right word for what he meant." "And Webb is one of these guardians?" Sarah asked. "Or something similar," Thomas agreed. "I noticed how the animals responded to him, completely calm in his presence, even when he moved suddenly or approached from behind. That's rare, especially with trail horses who've learned to be wary of any unexpected movement." Their conversation paused as the inn's door opened once more, revealing Edwin Collins, still fully dressed despite the late hour. The railway surveyor looked uncharacteristically hesitant, the rigid certainty that had defined his manner during their journey now notably absent. Without speaking, he joined them, choosing to stand rather than sit, his posture suggesting a man preparing himself for difficult admission. "I owe you all an apology," he said abruptly. "I was dismissive of your experiences, your beliefs." He stared out toward the darkened forest, hands clasped tightly behind his back. "My entire career is built on measurement, on transforming unknowns into known quantities that can be mapped, catalogued, and ultimately controlled. The fire," he shook his head slowly, "the fire exists beyond those parameters. Doesn't make your work any less valuable," Elijah offered quietly. "The railroad still needs proper surveying, regardless of what mysteries might exist alongside its tracks." Edwin acknowledged this with a slight nod, some tension visibly easing from his shoulders. "My grandfather was a minister," he said unexpectedly, "believed fervently in worlds beyond the visible. I chose a different path, science, rationality, provable facts. Thought I had to reject his beliefs entirely to embrace my own." A rueful smile briefly crossed his face. "Perhaps there's room for both perspectives after all." Their conversation continued as night deepened around Manzanita Post. 4 travelers bound together by shared experience of something beyond ordinary explanation. They spoke of previous encounters with the unexplainable, of stories heard in childhood, of moments when the solid world had briefly revealed deeper currents running beneath its surface. Not all mysteries were resolved, nor all questions answered, but the sharing itself provided its own form of illumination, human connection forged through mutual witness of the extraordinary. As their pipes burned out and yawns began punctuating the conversation with increasing frequency, they gradually dispersed to seek delayed rest. Elijah remained alone on the porch, rocking gently as he contemplated both their discussion and the experience that had prompted it. He found himself wondering how many other travelers throughout the years had gathered in similar fashion after encountering the mysterious campfire and its enigmatic tender. How many conversations had circled around the same questions they had explored tonight? Eventually, he too returned to his room, settling at the window for one final contemplation of the night. That's when he saw it, a small, steady light burning at the very edge of town, where no buildings stood, just visible through the trees. A campfire that hadn't been there earlier, appearing exactly where someone departing at first light might see it and draw momentary comfort from its familiar glow. That night, settled in the modest comfort of Manzanita Post's only inn, Elijah stood at his window, gazing toward the distant forest. Somewhere among those ancient trees, he knew, campfires were appearing for other travelers. Flames that burned without consuming, offering warmth and light to those who needed guidance through darkness, both physical and spiritual. The realization brought unexpected peace to his restless soul. For decades, he had wandered the changing frontier, witnessing the transformation of wild places into settlements and wondering if there would eventually be no trails left unexplored, no mysteries remaining to discover. Now he understood that some aspects of the wilderness would never be fully tamed or explained. That, alongside the advancing railroads and telegraph lines, existed currents of older magic, guardians of forgotten knowledge who moved between worlds as easily as crossing a stream. From somewhere in the distance, carried on the night breeze, came the faint notes of a harmonica playing that now familiar melody. Elijah smiled, recognizing the sound not as farewell, but as reminder. The campfire that never dies continued to burn somewhere ahead on the trail, offering its steady light to all who journeyed through uncertain territories. And Webb, whatever or whoever he might truly be, remained its faithful tender, guardian of wayfarers along paths both seen and unseen. With that comforting knowledge, Elijah turned from the window and prepared for sleep, certain that whenever his own trail grew dark or difficult, he need only listen for distant music and follow its call to find warmth, companionship, and the quiet assurance that no traveler ever walks entirely alone through the gathering night. As the memory of Elijah Morgan and the eternal campfire fades into the gentle darkness of sleep, another tale from the untamed frontier awaits. Just as Webb's harmonica notes dissolve into the night, new sounds emerge from the wilderness. The soft nickering of horses beneath a canopy of stars, and the whispered legends of a very special herd that roams the plains. The last copper rays of sunset stretched like weary fingers across the western horizon as Eleanor Hayes secured her canvas tent against the evening breeze. At 34, she had the weathered hands of someone who spent more time outdoors than in, her skin bronzed from countless days under open skies. Her father's old brass telescope rested nearby, already mounted on its worn wooden tripod, waiting patiently for night to deepen and reveal its celestial treasures. 3 nights she had camped in this remote corner of West Elizabeth's sprawling plains, and 3 nights she had scanned the heavens until her eyes burned with fatigue, searching for something most folks dismissed as mere campfire legend. The star-touched herd, they called it. a phantom procession of longhorns said to materialize in the night sky during rare celestial alignments. Spectral cattle, with coats that shimmered like stardust, galloping silently across the heaven. Her father, Thomas Hayes, had claimed to have witnessed it just once in his 73 years of life, on a clear autumn night much like this one. When Jupiter aligns with the Pleiades, he'd told her, his voice carrying that particular reverence he reserved for the truly extraordinary. And the new moon leaves the sky dark as creation. That's when they run, Ellie. That's when the sky becomes a prairie for spirits. Eleanor smiled at the memory as she arranged kindling for her evening fire. Her father had been many things: rancher, amateur astronomer, collector of frontier stories, but never a fanciful man given to exaggeration. If Thomas Hayes claimed to have seen celestial cattle streaming across the night sky, she believed him without reservation. What others might dismiss as the imaginings of an old man, she accepted as another mystery in a world still full of them, despite humanity's persistent efforts to catalogue and explain every natural wonder. The small fire caught quickly, flames dancing in the gathering darkness as Eleanor settled onto her bedroll, journal open across her knees. She recorded the date, October 17, 1907, and the conditions: clear skies, mild temperature, light westerly breeze. Below this, she sketched a rough star chart marking Jupiter's position relative to the Pleiades star cluster. According to her calculations, tonight would bring the closest alignment visible from this location in nearly 20 years. Whether this would prove sufficient to summon the phantom herd remained to be seen, but anticipation hummed through her veins nonetheless. "You always said patience was the naturalist's greatest virtue, Pa," she murmured, glancing toward the darkening eastern horizon where stars were beginning to appear like pinpricks in indigo fabric. "I suppose that applies to sky watching as well as tracking." As true night descended across the plains, Eleanor prepared her father's telescope with practiced care. The brass fittings gleamed warmly in the firelight as she cleaned the objective lens and checked the focusing mechanism. This instrument had been her inheritance, not merely the physical object, but the perspective it represented. Thomas Hayes had used it to introduce his daughter to the wonders above, teaching her constellation names and planetary movements when she was still young enough to believe the moon might be made of cheese if her father had claimed so. "The sky tells the oldest stories we know," he'd often said while adjusting the telescope on summer evenings outside their modest ranch house. "Older than books, older than writing, the first humans looked up and saw pictures, patterns, meanings. They weren't wrong to do so." Eleanor's memories of those lessons provided comfortable company as darkness completed its claim on the landscape. The distant howl of a coyote somewhere to the north reminded her that she wasn't truly alone out here, though human settlements were miles away. She had never feared solitude, had sought it often, in fact, finding clarity in the absence of others' expectations and judgments. Tonight, however, she felt a curious sensation of being watched, though not in any threatening way, more like the comfortable awareness of a friend's presence nearby, waiting to share something remarkable. With the fire banked to steady coals that cast just enough light to move safely around her small camp, Eleanor turned her full attention skyward. Thousands of stars now crowded the black expanse overhead, their brilliance undiminished by city lights or industrial haze. The Milky Way stretched across the celestial dome like a great silvery river, and familiar constellations took their places in the ancient, endless procession. She located Jupiter easily, the brightest object in the southeastern sky, its steady light distinguishing it from the twinkling stars surrounding it. The Pleiades cluster, that small, distinctive gathering of blue-white stars sometimes called the Seven Sisters, hung nearby. Eleanor checked their positions against her notes, confirming that the alignment appeared optimal. Now came the waiting, the patience her father had emphasized throughout her childhood education under the stars. "Look up when the stars run wild," he had whispered to her on his deathbed the previous spring, his weathered hand gripping hers with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll look up, Ellie." Those had been his last coherent words, though he had lingered for another day and night before quietly slipping away as dawn broke over the eastern hills, appropriately transitioning from one world to the next during that liminal moment between darkness and light. Eleanor had interpreted his final request as reference to the star-touched herd, the celestial phenomenon he'd described to her years earlier but which she had never witnessed herself. She had spent months afterward calculating potential viewing opportunities, correlating star charts with her father's fragmentary notes, until identifying this particular week in October as promising. 3 nights of watching had yielded nothing beyond conventional splendor, which was magnificent enough in its own right, but not the specific wonder she sought. Tonight, however, felt different. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, carrying unusual clarity that rendered distant stars sharp as diamond facets against black velvet. Eleanor found herself holding her breath at odd moments, as if anticipating some subtle change in the world around her. She alternated between studying the sky with naked eyes and peering through the telescope at specific celestial features, meticulously documenting her observations while remaining alert for any unusual phenomena. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped noticeably. Eleanor pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders and poured coffee from her enameled pot, warming her hands around the tin cup as much for comfort as for warmth. The steam rose in lazy spirals, momentarily obscuring her view before dissipating into the vast darkness overhead. "I'm here, Pa," she whispered, not entirely certain why she felt compelled to speak aloud. "I'm looking up, just like I promised." In that moment, a curious sensation washed over her, a peculiar stillness unlike anything she had previously experienced. The normal sounds of nighttime prairie, insect chirps, distant animal movements, the whisper of breeze through tall grass, abruptly ceased, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to possess physical presence. Even the gentle crackling of her campfire dimmed, as if sound itself had been temporarily suspended throughout the landscape. Eleanor remained motionless, coffee cup halfway to her lips, every sense alert to this extraordinary shift in her surroundings. The stars overhead appeared to intensify, their light strengthening to an almost painful brilliance that transformed the plains around her. Ordinary shadows gained substance and definition, creating a nighttime landscape nearly as visible as during daylight, though rendered in silver-poo moonlight without a moon. Movement at the eastern horizon caught her attention, a flicker of something luminous where empty sky had been moments earlier. Eleanor set down her cup with deliberate care and rose to her feet, gaze fixed on the distant edge of the world where light appeared to be gathering like storm clouds, except these formations shimmered with the distinctive twinkling quality of starlight rather than the solid mass of weather. "Oh, my stars," she breathed, as the shimmering intensified, coalescing into distinct forms that emerged from behind the horizon line. First came what appeared to be riders, 2 ghostly figures, astride horses that seemed constructed from concentrated starlight, their forms simultaneously translucent and perfectly defined, like crystal sculptures filled with luminous gas. Behind them materialized a procession that stole Eleanor's breath entirely. Dozens of longhorn cattle, their massive horns spanning widths impossible in flesh and blood animals, each spectral bovine glowing with the same starlight quality as the riders who guided them. The star-touched herd moved with impossible grace across the night sky, maintaining perfect formation as they ascended gradually from the horizon like celestial bodies, rising to claim their ordained positions. No sound accompanied their progress. No thundering hooves, no lowing calls, no shouts from the phantom cowboys who guided the ethereal cattle along their heavenly trail. They traversed the darkness in majestic silence, leaving trails of faint luminescence that lingered briefly before fading back into ordinary night. Eleanor stood transfixed, all scientific objectivity temporarily abandoned in pure wonder at the spectacle unfolding above her. The ghost herd passed directly overhead, close enough that she imagined she could distinguish individual patterns in their star-stuff hides, swirling nebula clouds and pinpoint constellations unique to each phantom animal. Their horns swept outward like extended arms embracing the cosmos, and their eyes, those were perhaps most extraordinary of all, appearing as perfect miniature galaxies containing countless stars in spiral formations. "You were right, Pa," she whispered, tears streaming unnoticed down her cheeks. "They're real. They're beautiful." As if in response to her words, one of the spectral riders seemed to pause momentarily, turning toward her with a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or greeting, a subtle tip of an ethereal hat, before continuing onward with the procession. The gesture carried such familiar quality that Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Though distance and the rider's luminous nature prevented clear identification of features, something in the posture and movement triggered recognition that resonated through her being. "Pa," she called softly, the question carrying no further than her own ears. The rider had already returned attention to the herd, continuing westward across the starry expanse, without further acknowledgement of the solitary human witness below. The procession continued for what might have been minutes or hours. Time seemed as insubstantial as the phantom cattle themselves, while Eleanor watched their journey. Eventually, they began descending toward the western horizon, their luminosity gradually diminishing as they approached the edge of the visible world. One by one, the spectral longhorns disappeared beyond that threshold, followed by the riders who maintained their vigilant positions at rear and flank. The last glimmers of their passage vanished, like stars extinguished by dawn, though the night remained deep around Eleanor's solitary camp. With their departure, normal sounds returned to the prairie. Insects resumed their chirping chorus, nocturnal rodents rustled through nearby grasses, and the gentle breeze carried its whispered melody across the landscape once more. The stars overhead returned to their ordinary brilliance, still magnificent, but no longer possessing the extraordinary luminosity that had transformed the night during the herd's passage. Eleanor remained standing, gaze fixed on the western horizon where the last phantom rider had disappeared, feeling simultaneously elated and bereft. She had witnessed something few humans had seen, perhaps something her father alone had documented in recent generations, yet its departure left curious emptiness, as if some essential truth had been revealed and then withdrawn before she could fully comprehend its meaning. Eventually, practical considerations reasserted themselves. The night had grown substantially colder during her entranced observation, and her fire required attention if she wished to maintain even minimal warmth until morning. Moving with the careful deliberation of someone emerging from deep meditation, Eleanor knelt beside the glowing embers and added several small branches, watching as flames gradually reclaimed the woodpile. Her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved her journal and opened to a fresh page. How does one document the undocumentable? What words could possibly capture the ethereal magnificence of cattle constructed from starlight moving across the cosmic prairie? Scientific training urged objective recording of observable phenomena, while her poet's heart demanded acknowledgement of the experience's profound emotional impact. In the end, she chose the simplest approach, a straightforward account of what she had witnessed, accompanied by sketches that could never fully capture the luminous quality of the phantom herd, but might at least suggest their formation and movement. She noted the precise time, the stellar conditions, the unusual silence that had preceded their appearance, and the familiar gesture of the trailing rider that had stirred such powerful recognition within her. Whether vision, natural phenomenon, or something beyond current scientific understanding, she wrote in conclusion, the experience has left me with certainty that the boundaries between worlds, whether defined as life and death, material and spiritual, known and unknown, are perhaps more permeable than conventional wisdom suggests. Pa always said the sky tells the oldest stories. Tonight, I glimpsed a chapter few have been privileged to read. With her observations recorded, Eleanor finally succumbed to the physical and emotional exhaustion her supernatural encounter had temporarily suspended. She lay back on her bedroll, gaze still fixed on the star-filled expanse overhead, and allowed sleep to claim her beneath the same cosmic canopy that had just hosted the extraordinary procession. Her dreams that night were vivid with starlight and memory, her father's voice guiding her through constellation patterns, his patient hands adjusting telescope settings, his stories of frontier days when the land below mirrored the wildness above. The cattle that crossed these plains in life, he told her in one particularly vivid dream sequence, find freedom crossing the heavens after death. They run forever, Ellie, in skies where no fences exist. Morning arrived with rose gold light spreading across the eastern plains, gently pulling Eleanor from sleep, filled with celestial imagery. She woke, feeling curiously refreshed despite the late hour at which she had finally closed her eyes. Something fundamental had shifted within her. Not merely confirmation of her father's extraordinary claim, but deeper understanding of connection between terrestrial existence and cosmic mystery that had always underpinned his worldview. As she prepared breakfast over a freshly built fire, Eleanor contemplated her next steps. She had witnessed the star-touched herd as hoped, fulfilling both her scientific curiosity and her promise to her father. Logic suggested returning home with her documentation, perhaps sharing her findings with select colleagues who might appreciate their significance without dismissing them as mere fantasy or hallucination. Yet something held her in place, an intuition that her experience, remarkable as it had been, represented merely initial contact with something deserving further investigation. The memory of that familiar gesture from the trailing rider tugged at her consciousness, suggesting unfinished communication or incomplete revelation. One sighting, however extraordinary, provided limited understanding of any natural phenomenon. Multiple observations under varying conditions were necessary for meaningful conclusion. Science requires verification, she murmured, quoting one of her father's frequent admonitions. One sighting is anecdote, multiple sightings begin pattern recognition. As afternoon waned toward evening, Eleanor noticed riders approaching from the south, unusual occurrence given her deliberately remote location. She watched their approach with mild concern, one hand resting casually near the revolver she carried for protection against coyotes and other potential dangers of solitary. Three figures gradually resolved from heat shimmer along the horizon, moving at unhurried pace that suggested purpose rather than urgency. When they drew close enough for identification, Eleanor relaxed marginally. The lead rider was instantly recognizable, despite years since their last encounter. Arthur Morgan, foreman of the neighboring Willoughby Ranch, where she had occasionally purchased supplies during previous research expeditions in the region. The other two riders were unfamiliar to her, though their manner and equipment marked them as working cowboys rather than potential troublemakers. "Miss Hayes," Arthur called as they approached, raising his hat in polite greeting. "Thought that might be your camp. Kind of surprised to find you out here all on your lonesome." "Mr. Morgan," she acknowledged with small nod. "Just doing some night sky observation. Perfect conditions this time of year." Arthur dismounted with fluid grace that belied his considerable size, motioning for his companions to remain mounted. In his mid-50s now, he retained the powerful build and watchful demeanor that had made him legendary among local ranchers for his ability to handle both cattle and the occasionally troublesome men who worked them. His face had weathered into deeper creases since Eleanor had last seen him, and his formerly dark hair had given way entirely to steel grey. But his eyes remained sharply observant beneath heavy brows. "Stargazing, huh?" he commented, glancing toward her telescope with the respectful caution many frontier folk exhibited toward unfamiliar scientific equipment. "Seems awful remote location for such pursuits." "Less light interference out here," Eleanor explained, recognizing the unspoken question regarding a woman camping alone in isolated territory. "Makes for clearer observation." Arthur nodded acceptance of this explanation, though subtle tension in his posture suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied. "We're tracking strays from the north pasture," he offered by way of explaining their own presence. "Thought you might have seen signs of cattle passing through recently." Eleanor hesitated briefly, uncertain whether to mention her extraordinary experience from the previous night. Arthur Morgan had a reputation for straightforward practicality, unlikely to accommodate notions of spectral cattle traversing night skies. Yet something in his weathered features, perhaps quality of having witnessed too much during his long years on frontier to dismiss unusual possibilities outright, encouraged candor. "No ordinary cattle," she replied carefully. "But I did see something rather remarkable overhead last night." Arthur's expression shifted subtly, interest replacing professional inquiry. "That right? Something astronomical, I assume, in a manner of speaking," Eleanor acknowledged, deciding to test waters cautiously. "Are you familiar with stories about the star-touched herd, Mr. Morgan?" The change in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. His shoulders straightened and his gaze intensified with focus that suggested personal connection to her inquiry rather than mere curiosity. He glanced briefly toward his mounted companions before returning attention to Eleanor. "Boys," he called without looking away from her, "ride on ahead and check that ravine we passed about 2 miles back. Might be our strays found water there. I'll catch up shortly." The cowboys exchanged brief glance before nodding acknowledgement. "Whatever you say, boss," the older one replied, though his tone carried hint of curiosity regarding this unexpected detour in their search. They turned their horses with practiced ease and departed at casual trot, occasionally glancing back until distance rendered their expressions unreadable. When they had moved beyond reasonable hearing distance, Arthur turned back to Eleanor with transformed expression. The professional ranch foreman replaced by someone who appeared simultaneously younger and more vulnerable, as if her question had breached carefully maintained barrier between public persona and private experience. "My grandfather claimed to have seen it 3 times during his life," he said without preamble, voice lowered though no one remained to overhear. "Said it was herd that never made it to market during the blizzard of '67. Nearly 500 head and 12 cowboys, all lost in storms so fierce it erased the trail completely. Searching parties found nothing until spring thaw revealed scattered bones across 20 miles of prairie." Eleanor nodded encouragement, recognizing Story's alignment with various regional accounts she had collected regarding the phantom herd's potential origin. Different witnesses attributed different historical sources to the apparition, though most narratives involve cattle that had perished under tragic circumstances during pioneering era. And you? She prompted gently. Have you seen it yourself? Arthur's expression grew distant, gaze fixed on horizon rather than Eleanor's face. Once, he admitted after prolonged silence. About 15 years ago, during that drought period when we nearly lost everything, was out checking water sources middle of the night, half dead from exhaustion and worry. Saw them moving across the sky like they owned it. Silent as moonlight, but clear as day. He shook his head slowly, returning to present moment with visible effort. Never told anyone. Who'd believe such nonsense from a man who deals in flesh and blood, steers selling by pound at market? I would, Eleanor said simply. I saw them last night. Arthur studied her with intensity that might have been uncomfortable had it not contained such evident hunger for confirmation of his own experience. You Thomas Hayes's daughter, he stated rather than asked. He was known for having clear eyes about unusual matters. He saw them too, she confirmed. Just once, near the end of his life. His last words to me were about looking up when the stars run wild. That's why I'm here. Fulfilling that final request, understanding passed between them, the shared recognition of having experienced something beyond ordinary explanation, yet undeniably real. Arthur removed his hat, running his hand through grey hair with gesture that suggested both thoughtfulness and decision-making. There's someone you should meet, he said finally, replacing his hat with deliberate care. Man named Harlan Webb. Lives about 5 miles northeast of here, an old trapper's cabin most folks don't even know exists. Bit of a hermit, but knows more about the star-touched herd than anyone living. An astronomer? Eleanor asked, curiosity immediately engaged. Arthur's mouth quirked in brief wry smile. Of sorts. Though he'd likely bristle at the formal title. He calls himself a celestial chronicler. Been documenting sky phenomena in these parts for nearly 30 years from what I understand. Particular interest in where science and folklore intersect. This description aligned precisely with Eleanor's own research interests, triggering immediate desire to make this stranger's acquaintance. How does one arrange introduction to someone who prefers isolation? She inquired, recognizing potential difficulties in approaching confirmed recluse without proper social protocols. I check on him occasionally, Arthur explained. Bring supplies, make sure he's still among the living. Was planning to ride that way tomorrow or next day. He studied her thoughtfully before continuing. Could take you there, if you're interested. Man rarely gets chance to discuss his observations with someone who might actually understand them. Eleanor considered the offer carefully. While she had planned another night of independent observation, the opportunity to consult with established researcher, however unconventional, who shared her specific interest in the star-touched herd, represented potentially valuable resource. Her father had often emphasized importance of combining personal observation with comparative data from multiple sources when investigating natural phenomena. I would appreciate the introduction, she decided, though I had hoped for another night of observation here, given the favorable celestial alignment. Arthur nodded understanding. Webb's place has better elevation anyway, sits on ridge overlooking most of the Northern Territory. If conditions remain suitable, you'd have superior vantage point for continued observation. This practical consideration settled the matter. Eleanor agreed to break camp following morning and accompany Arthur to the reclusive Celestial Chronicler's residence. They arranged meeting time that would accommodate both her preferred morning routine and his necessary ranch responsibilities, parting with mutual expressions of anticipation regarding the planned introduction. Morning brought crystalline clarity to the prairie, with distant landmarks visible in sharp relief against cloudless blue sky. Eleanor broke camp with practiced efficiency, packing equipment and supplies onto her sturdy Pinto mare with methodical care that distributed weight evenly for comfortable travel. By the time Arthur Morgan appeared on the southeastern horizon, she waited ready-mounted, telescope and other delicate instruments secured in padded saddlebags designed specifically for field research expeditions. "Morning, Miss Hayes," Arthur greeted as he approached. Unlike previous day, he rode alone, his powerful chestnut gelding moving with easy stride that spoke of many miles shared between horse and rider. "Ready for your introduction to Webb?" "Indeed," Eleanor confirmed, automatically assessing the weather and trail conditions with experienced eye. "Lead on, Mr. Morgan." They rode northeast at comfortable pace, crossing rolling prairie, gradually transitioning toward more varied terrain as they approached region where the Great Plains began yielding to scattered woodland and occasional rocky outcroppings. Arthur proved companionable traveler, balancing respectful silence with informative commentary about landmarks and territory they traversed. Eleanor appreciated both his knowledge and his unobtrusive manner, which allowed her to maintain scientific observations of surrounding ecosystem without constant conversational demands. Approximately 2 hours into their journey, Arthur guided them toward increasingly elevated landscape, culminating in prominent ridge that commanded sweeping views across northern plains. As they ascended gradual slope, Eleanor noted progressive changes in vegetation, prairie grasses giving way to scattered juniper and pine that thrived in the rockier soil of higher elevation. "Webb chose his location carefully," Arthur commented as they approached final rise before their destination. "Natural spring provides year-round water, elevation offers perspective on both land and sky, and the ridge itself creates natural windbreak against winter storms. Man may be peculiar in his ways, but no one questions his practical intelligence." The cabin materialized suddenly as they crested the ridge. Small structure of weathered logs nestled against rocky outcropping that provided additional shelter from prevailing winds. What distinguished it immediately from typical frontier dwelling was the curious addition constructed onto its eastern side. Circular platform supporting what appeared to be custom-built telescope, considerably larger than Eleanor's own portable instrument. Several additional scientific devices were positioned strategically around the property, including what she recognized as basic meteorological monitoring equipment. "Impressive," she murmured, professional interest immediately engaged by evidence of serious astronomical research being conducted in this remote location. As they approached the cabin, its door opened to reveal tall, lean figure who observed their arrival with obvious interest, rather than the suspicion Eleanor might have expected from confirmed recluse. Harlan Webb appeared to be in his 60s, with wild white hair and beard framing remarkably youthful face, dominated by extraordinarily clear blue eyes that assessed the visitors with penetrating intelligence. "Morgan," he called in surprisingly resonant voice, "you've brought company. How unusual." "Webb," Arthur acknowledged, with casual nod that suggested comfortable familiarity beneath formal address. "This here's Miss Eleanor Hayes, daughter of Thomas Hayes. She's conducting some celestial research that might interest you." The older man's expression transformed instantly at mention of Eleanor's father, intense curiosity replacing polite inquiry. "Thomas Hayes' daughter," he repeated, approaching with more animated movement than his age might have suggested. "The cartographer who mapped stellar movements against frontier expansion patterns." Eleanor dismounted, pleasantly surprised by this accurate characterization of her father's unconventional research. "You knew his work?" "Corresponded briefly about 20 years ago," Webb confirmed, extending hand in greeting. "Never had pleasure of meeting in person, but his observational methodology regarding transit patterns of the Taurus constellation relative to seasonal cattle movements was genuinely innovative. This specific reference to obscure aspect of her father's research established Webb's credibility more effectively than any formal credentials might have done. Eleanor shook his offered hand with genuine enthusiasm, recognizing potential for truly meaningful exchange rather than merely polite professional courtesy. Arthur, sensing their immediate connection, gracefully extracted himself after a brief explanation that ranch responsibilities required his return. "Webb knows how to find me if you need anything," he assured Eleanor before departing. "And Miss Hayes? I'd be interested to hear your conclusions when your research concludes." With Arthur's departure, Harlan Webb invited Eleanor into his cabin with surprisingly conventional hospitality for man commonly described as hermit. The interior revealed fascinating juxtaposition of frontier practicality and scientific sophistication. Handmade furniture and basic living arrangements, sharing space with extensive library of astronomical texts, and walls covered with meticulously drawn star charts, annotated with observations spanning decades. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Webb asked, without preamble, once they were seated with cups of surprisingly excellent coffee. The star-touched herd. "That's why you're here." Eleanor appreciated his directness. 2 nights ago, during the Jupiter Pylades convergence, my father mentioned witnessing it once under similar conditions. Webb nodded vigorously, excitement visible in his animated expression. "The convergence creates what I call a stellar gateway. Specific astronomical alignment that temporarily weakens boundaries between perceptible reality dimensions. Under such conditions, phenomena normally invisible to human perception occasionally become observable to properly attuned witnesses." While his terminology suggested more mystical approach than Eleanor's scientific training typically accommodated, she recognized substantial observational foundation underlying his theoretical framework. "You've documented multiple appearances, 17 distinct manifestations over 28 years, Webb confirmed, rising to retrieve leather-bound journal from nearby shelf. "Complete astronomical conditions for each sighting, detailed sketches of formation patterns, duration measurements, and precise celestial positioning throughout each transit." He opened the journal to reveal meticulously documented observations recorded with scientific precision that would have satisfied most academic institutions, despite subject matter they might have dismissed as folklore or hallucination. Eleanor leaned forward with genuine interest, recognizing research methodology that paralleled her father's approach, despite different terminology and conceptual frameworks. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the journal. Webb hesitated only momentarily before carefully transferring the precious documentation to her hands. Action that conveyed profound trust between fellow researchers regardless of their different backgrounds and approaches. For several minutes, Eleanor studied the detailed records with growing appreciation for both their scientific rigor and the extraordinary phenomenon they documented. "Your observations regarding their movement patterns align precisely with what I witnessed," she confirmed, indicating particular diagram that mapped the herd's transit relative to specific constellations. This formation especially, the lead steer creating perfect alignment with Aldebaran while trailing riders positioned relative to Orion's belt. Exactly as I observed. Their conversation quickly evolved into enthusiastic exchange of observations, theories, and methodological approaches that transcended conventional boundaries between academic science and frontier naturalism. Webb shared his extensive documentation collected across decades, while Eleanor contributed perspectives gained through her formal training in astronomy and natural history. What emerged through their dialogue was remarkably coherent understanding of phenomenon that occupied liminal space between physical reality and perceptual mystery. As midnight approached on Eleanor's first night at Webb's observatory, they prepared for potential reappearance of the phantom herd. Jupiter and the Pleiades maintained their convergence, though subtle shifts in their relative positions had occurred since Eleanor's initial sighting. Webb's sophisticated equipment allowed for more precise monitoring of celestial conditions, while his elevated vantage point provided superior viewing perspective compared to Eleanor's previous location. Shortly after 1 o'clock, the familiar atmospheric change manifested. That curious stillness where normal nighttime sounds temporarily suspended, creating profound silence that seemed to possess physical presence. Both researchers immediately recognized the significance of this sensory shift, focusing intensified attention toward the eastern horizon. Within minutes, the star-touched herd materialized against the dark sky, first as diffuse luminosity resembling specialized cloud formation, then rapidly coalescing into distinct forms, recognizable as the spectral longhorns and their accompanying riders. The apparition maintained consistent characteristics with Eleanor's previous sighting, though subtle variations in formation suggested response to slightly different celestial conditions. What distinguished this experience from Eleanor's solitary encounter was the extraordinary perspective provided by Webb's sophisticated telescope. While maintaining overall awareness of the herd's transit across the night sky, they could also observe individual specimens in remarkable detail, impossible with ordinary equipment or naked eye observation. The telescopic view revealed internal structure of the phantom cattle that confirmed Webb's theories regarding their composition. Bodies that appeared constructed from concentrated stellar material, organized into recognizable bovine form while maintaining distinct astronomical characteristics. Look at the stellar nuclei within the primary thoracic region, Webb directed, adjusting the telescope's focus to highlight specific features consistent with Taurus constellation patterning, but reconfigured into biological rather than geometric arrangement. Most remarkable was their unified movement across the celestial landscape. Not merely individual entities traveling together, but coherent system, moving as integrated whole like vast celestial organism, composed of distinct but fundamentally connected components. The spectral riders maintained their positions relative to the herd with unwavering precision, guiding the luminous cattle along invisible pathways that corresponded with specific star alignments rather than terrestrial geography. As the procession reached position directly overhead, Eleanor focused attention on the trailing rider, who had made that seemingly familiar gesture during her previous observation. The superior magnification of Webb's telescope allowed significantly better view of the figure, though specific facial features remained indistinct due to the luminous nature of the apparition. Yet something in the rider's posture and movement triggered same profound recognition she had experienced before. Sensation of familiarity so intense it transcended rational explanation. "The last rider," she said softly. "There's something." Webb adjusted the telescope to center this figure in their field of view. "Personal connection?" he inquired, his tone suggesting recognition of observation's significance while maintaining scientific context. "I believe it's my father," Eleanor acknowledged, balancing emotional response against objective observation, or perhaps more accurately, pattern-containing aspects of his consciousness preserved within larger phenomenon. Webb nodded thoughtfully, neither dismissing her interpretation nor imposing alternate explanation. "Consciousness as pattern," he mused, "potentially maintainable beyond biological termination under specific conditions connected to lifelong interests and associations. Your father's combined dedication to astronomy and cattle culture could create particularly robust pattern persistence. This perspective, framing potential posthumous manifestation within conceptual framework of pattern conservation rather than supernatural survival, offered Eleanor meaningful context for processing her experience without abandoning scientific principles that had guided her professional life. The possibility that humans might persist as recognizable patterns within natural systems rather than discrete supernatural entities aligned with emerging scientific understandings while accommodating profound personal significance of her repeated observation. In the days and weeks that followed, Eleanor divided her time between independent field research and collaborative work with Webb, whose vast collection of astronomical observations provided invaluable comparative data for contextualizing her own documentation of the star-touched herd. Their partnership developed into uniquely productive exchange, bridging conventional academic methodology and frontier naturalism traditions. The phantom herd appeared twice more during that season, each manifestation occurring during specific celestial alignments that Webb had previously identified as conducive to dimensional permeability. Eleanor documented these appearances with increasing sophistication, combining emotional appreciation for their profound beauty with rigorous analysis of their astronomical correlations and movement patterns. By season's end, Eleanor had compiled sufficient documentation to begin drafting monograph, combining her field observations with broader theoretical framework regarding phenomena that occupied liminal space between conventional scientific categories. Though she harbored no illusions regarding potential academic reception of work dealing with spectral cattle traversing night skies, she remained committed to maintaining highest standards of observational rigor and theoretical coherence. "Your father would be proud," Webb told her during her final visit before returning east for winter, not merely for documenting the phenomenon itself, but for maintaining balance between wonder and analysis that characterized his own approach to natural mysteries. On her final night at Webb's Ridgetop Observatory, Eleanor stood alone beneath star-filled sky that had revealed its extraordinary secrets through patient observation and receptive awareness. The phantom herd would not appear tonight. The necessary celestial alignment had shifted beyond optimal parameters, yet she felt profound connection to both the phenomenon itself and the broader traditions of observation that had guided her exploration. "I saw them, Pa," she whispered to the brilliant canopy overhead. "I looked up when the stars run wild, just like you asked. And I'll keep looking, keep documenting, keep wondering." The stars continued their eternal wheeling across the cosmic prairie, carrying patterns of light that contained perhaps more significance than humans had yet discovered. Eleanor Hayes watched their journey with scientists' precision and poets' appreciation, comfortable in knowledge that some truths revealed themselves only to those patient enough to wait, observant enough to see, and humble enough to wonder. The star-touched herd would run again when conditions aligned properly, and she would be watching, continuing dialogue between earth and sky that had begun with first human gaze upward and would persist as long as stars remained to guide night wanderers home. And so, partner, as our tale rides off into the sunset, it's time for you to rest your weary bones beneath the endless prairie sky. Let the sounds of the west be your lullaby tonight, from the gentle crackle of the campfire to the soft prairie winds and the distant song of nightbirds, all flowing uninterrupted, with no advertisements to break the peace of your slumber. Sweet dreams, cowpoke, and may your trail lead to peaceful pastures tonight.